the Annandale Jane Doe, also known as the Christmas Lady, identified as Joyce Marilyn Meyer Sommers. Joyce was 69 and the oldest of 5 children, in a family from Davenport, Iowa. She was also what would become a famous Jane Doe. She was found by a groundskeeper at the Pleasant Valley Memorial Park in Annandale, Virginia, in December of 1996. She was found in a section designated for the burial of infants. It was considered that she could have chosen this area because she was related to one of the children there, but there wasn't any proof that this was the case. It would also turn out that it wasn't true. She wasn't found near any specific grave. She was found with a small 8-inch Christmas tree, which would lead to her becoming known as the Christmas Tree Lady. They knew she was around 5 feet tall and aged 50 to 70 with red hair. But who was she? That question endured for 26 years. They would do a toxicology report on her, and it revealed alcohol and Valium in her system at the time of her death. There was also a plastic bag that caused suffocation. She had 2 $50 bills, designating one for the coroner and one for the cemetery. The note was found saying, "Deceased by own hand. Prefer no autopsy. Please order cremation with funds provided. Thank you, Jane Doe." She had with her a green knapsack with bifocals, a red scarf, and an empty bottle of brandy. She also had 2 empty bottles of juice and a plastic cup. She had taken along a Walkman and some comedy cassettes that included Mel Brooks, Carl Reiner, Jeff Foxworthy, and Monty Python's Holy Grail. They believed that she was listening to this as she passed. She had with her a typewritten poem that many speculated she wrote herself. It said, "Now I lay me down to sleep, soon to drift to the eternal deep, and though I die and shall not wake, sleep sweeter will be than this life I forsake." A cold case squad in Fairfax County, Virginia, tried to match her to missing person cases, but they were unable to do so. In the year 2000, this colorized sketch was released in hopes that someone might recognize her. But it was not until Othram Labs became involved that we got an answer. They have done so much to identify John and Jane Does. They were able to use advanced DNA processing to match her with a relative using the free genealogical site GEDmatch. The case itself was crowdfunded by DNA Solves, with an anonymous donor giving a large amount of money. DNA Solves is a website produced by Othram Labs themselves that also does crowdfunding to help with the identification of John and Jane Does. In May of 2022, investigative leads returned to the detectives, and finally it was narrowed down to one suspected family member. Often it doesn't lead directly to one person, and they will contact someone with related DNA, and that person's input leads to the next person that they will request DNA from, and so on and so forth. It can be time intensive, and in this case it did eventually lead to the 4 siblings of Joyce Sommers. Her family later commented that she was a planner and was very careful, and they believed she purposely was somewhere that they would not be able to find her name. It turns out that Joyce had moved to Virginia from Iowa sometime in the late 1980s. She was living alone in an area, and she was never reported missing. That doesn't mean she wasn't missed, though, and in fact she was. Her siblings had even hired a private investigator to try to find her location, but it didn't work. Joyce didn't have any children, nor was she tied to the area where she was found, and because she had made the effort to distance herself from her family, the question of why she did what she did will probably never be answered. It's clear she put a lot of thought and effort into how it all went down. It also brings forth the question whether or not it's unfair to identify somebody who didn't want to be identified. I guess you have to weigh that against whether or not the family deserves to know what happened to somebody they love and care about. Let me know what your thoughts are on this subject below. I can see both sides of it, but ultimately my preference is that they identify everybody. At this point, the identification is for the people left behind. It can't hurt Joyce anymore. Joyce Marilyn Meyer Sommers went unidentified for 26 years. She was found nearly 900 miles away from where she grew up. Princess Doe, identified as Dawn Rita Olanick. A press conference was held by the New Jersey State Police on Friday, July 15, 2022, to announce that not only was Princess Doe finally identified after 40 years, but they also had the man responsible. And it's too bad that it doesn't happen more often. A lot of times they don't look for the perpetrator's DNA when they're processing the doe. At least that's the policy of the DNA Doe Project. I'm not sure about other organizations. Princess Doe was found in Blairstown, New Jersey on July 15, 1982. She got her nickname because she was small in size and she didn't appear very old. And it's long been a case that touched the lives of a lot of people. It's a reminder of all the men and women who still have yet to get their names back. There are around 40,000 currently waiting for their name, and in the meantime listed as a John or Jane Doe. And of course, with every case here like this, there's a family waiting to find out what happened to somebody that they love. Dawn was estimated to be 14 to 18 years old, around 5'2" and 110 pounds. She'd been found by workers at the Cedar Ridge Cemetery on Route 94 in Blairstown, Warren County. She'd been thrown into a ravine adjacent to the cemetery. She was the victim of blows by a blunt instrument. The young doe was wearing some pretty distinctive clothing when she was found. Despite the fact they thought it might lead to her identity, it didn't. Nor did it lead at the time to who took her life. They were able to tell very little, though they knew she had alcohol in her system and she did have defensive wounds. The following year, on June 30th, 1983, Princess Doe became known as the first person entered into the FBI's brand new National Computerized System that was developed for unidentified doe files. Her case is now a textbook course taught at the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia. She brought so much awareness that there were so many like her out there that had gone unidentified for so many years. The people of Blairstown, New Jersey were so touched by her loss that they moved to donate a funeral and a resting place. The inscription on the stone simply read, "Princess Doe, missing from home, dead among strangers, remembered by all, born," and a question mark, found July 15, 1982. The Warren County Police Department pieced together tips from out of state, and they suggested she'd been working in hotel housekeeping in a seasonal capacity, working in various hotels that ranged from Ocean City, Maryland, to where she was found. Tips came in from as many as 6 people, suggesting this lead was true. But we now know this wasn't the case. 13 years after Princess Doe was found, in 1999, and then again in 2005, a man named Arthur Kinlaw, who was already incarcerated for a similar crime, wrote to authorities and confessed to taking her life. They believe that he offered her money and demanded she have relations with him, and she refused. This angered Kinlaw. It's believed that he then took her life. Later it was stated that he and his wife trafficked women in their home in the Bronx. They chose not to charge Kinlaw, saying there was a lack of evidence. That, however, seems to have changed. It's possible they processed both the victim and the perpetrator's DNA at the same time. This case, for once, has fully been considered closed. Instead of just providing an identity, it appears Kinlaw has finally been charged. We know now that Princess Doe was a 17-year-old young woman named Dawn Olanick. They also announced that Kinlaw had taken the lives of others, forged documents, stole, and generally hurt anyone he could. He was likely trying to prey on the young woman. And Dawn herself had been told to leave her home by her family for unknown reasons. His wife would later say he threatened her and burned their vehicle right after Dawn was found. Dawn had been missing 21 days when her remains were found. Because she was over 100 miles away in Blairstown, New Jersey, her identity wasn't discovered. 40 years would pass before her family would know what happened to her. I wish there was more information I could provide about Dawn's circumstances. I'm sure her family regretted whatever led to her being removed from the home, probably for every day since she went missing. It was her brother who confirmed that Dawn had been asked to leave, though if he mentioned more about why, it hasn't been disclosed. They list her date of disappearance as June 24th, 1982. Because they have this date, it likely means she was reported missing in some way, although that's not specifically stated. Dawn was identified 40 years and 1 day after she was found. The Henry County John Doe, identified as Daniel S. Diaz. This is one of those cases that really bothers me, because this is another one where all of the pieces were there the entire time. In fact, I covered this story as an unidentified John Doe a while back. Daniel was found behind an abandoned gas station on October 2nd, 2000 in Henry County, Indiana. It was then 2 police officers who were escorting a prisoner found themselves needing to find an accessible bathroom, and they chose outside. And it's lucky they did. They decided to stop at an abandoned gas station and pulled behind it. They were unprepared for the shocking discovery of the man who, for 2 decades, became the Henry County John Doe. He'd been shot, and he was found without any identification. And it would turn out he'd actually only been there a short time, and it was lucky he'd been found at all. They were able to trace him through witness statements because he was found so soon as having shopped at a Walmart in Reynoldsburg, Ohio, only 2 days prior. He was actually seen at that time driving a red vehicle, but that vehicle has never been found, and no more leads were forthcoming. The coroner actually did everything he could and beyond in trying to identify this young man. He was pretty new on the job, and he tried for years to identify him. They gathered fingerprints, DNA, dental records, but nothing ever turned up. So it's a little shocking that it was one of those very fingerprints finally processed by the FBI that made the identification. I covered a number of cases recently that were identified via fingerprints thanks to a new DNA processing program for hard-to-read prints. But there's some indication that this wasn't one of those cases, or at least it isn't noted as such, and the others were. And because he was found relatively soon, it's probable that fingerprints were taken successfully from the start. It seems to be, in those cases, they were fingerprints found on somebody who had been there a little bit longer, and as such had degraded. This is just a guess on my part, though. It's sad if the FBI had it all along and could have identified them. This is why centralized databases are so important. The statement on this case, in fact, says, the FBI got a hit on the fingerprints that were sent to them when he was first found. So the 20 years that passed do seem excessive and completely unnecessary. It was February of 2022 that the fingerprint match was first made, matching the print from his remains to a previous arrest. It was then that they took it upon themselves to be sure that his next of kin was identified. It would take 4 months, but they did eventually find his family. The FBI stated that his identification was made through photographs and personal information. No photographs have been released so far publicly, at least at the point when my research was done. But there are multiple post-mortem photos that show the recreation here is pretty accurate. All of this time, Daniel Diaz's family thought he had chosen to walk away. They believe he chose to cut ties, which isn't an uncommon belief for families. Detectives spoke to both his parents and siblings. It was a great shock to learn that it wasn't a choice made by Daniel, but rather a choice made for him. They were described as distraught and emotional, and they tried to process all that time that Daniel was gone. It was healing for them to know that he didn't just walk away from them. Despite the sadness of learning of his fate, he'd been buried in a donated grave with a headstone that read, "Here lies a young man that only God knows." Daniel's family had decided to leave his grave where it is, planning to change the marker to celebrate his life. Daniel was 26 when his life was taken. If anyone has any information at all as to who did this, please call the number on the screen. Daniel Diaz went unidentified for 18 years. The Gregg County Jane Doe, identified as Pamela Young. Pamela Darlene Young was a petite 27-year-old young woman who grew up near the Blue Ridge Mountains. She eventually chose to relocate to Texas, and then, much to their sadness, she stopped communicating with them. Because they believed this was a conscious choice, no one reported her missing. She was last known to be seen in 1998. Like way too many people I've covered, she was found accidentally. It's hard not to think about how many people out there who aren't as lucky as her. Archaeologists were out in an open field in Gregg County, Texas, on May 21, 2002, simply collecting soil samples. It was then that they discovered a skull and a partial skeleton. The medical examiner would estimate she was either white or Hispanic, aged 16 to 30, and had been there approximately 2 years. In 2013, her skull would receive a 3D reconstruction, and it was there that they learned she had a cleft palate that had never been repaired. In 2019, the sheriff's office turned to the DNA Doe Project for help. But it would not be until 2022 that an answer was found using mitochondrial DNA. They were able to trace her back to Virginia and then North Carolina. This eventually led to Pamela's family. She had moved to Texas and did have a cleft palate. Just to double check, although they were pretty sure they found the right person, they decided to try to find proof of life, and a record search would be done. There was only a record of her being alive till around 1998. So it was with this they were pretty sure they had found Pamela Darlene Young. It's not clear if she had children, although she's pictured with one or more children in the 2 photos that were released. According to the Sheriff's Department, at this time there are no other leads in this case. It is not known exactly how Ms. Young came to be in that open field, and no cause of death was ever determined. It is so important that if anyone knows about her movements around this time, that they please call the number on the screen. Pamela Young went unidentified for 20 years. The Rosemount John Doe, identified as James Everett. James was found on September 26, 2014, inside of a shed. The 48-year-old man had been living in a decommissioned railroad switching shed behind the American Legion in Rosemount, Minnesota. The dates on the newspapers that were found with his belongings, that he had perhaps been using to stay warm, had the dates of October and December 2013, and they believed he'd been there since that time. Temperatures in December in that area usually fall between 34 degrees Fahrenheit to -8 Fahrenheit, so it's possible that hypothermia was the cause. His belongings included a leather jacket, glasses, an earring that was in one ear, and a knife with a sheath that included a picture of the Confederate flag and a number of initials. He was remembered by workers at the Quick Trip convenience store that was located nearby. He just suddenly stopped coming into the store. James Everett went unidentified for 7 years. The Weeki Wachee Jane Doe, identified as Teresa Caroline Fillingham. Billy Mansfield Sr. was a predator who was convicted of victimizing dozens of children. His namesake, Billy Mansfield Jr., modeled himself after this father. He dropped out of high school at age 14, falsifying his ID and joining the Army, where he became an alcoholic and a drug addict, eventually marrying and having several kids. Everyone who knew him knew he had a violent temper and that he wasn't burdened by a conscience. He racked up a list of crimes that included battery, kidnapping, and because of the usual dance I have to do around words because of YouTube, I'll just say the other crime he was known for is SA. By the time he met a 30-year-old woman named Renee Saling at a bar in California on December 6, 1980, he was already a pretty bad guy. The two were seen leaving the bar, and the next morning she was found in a drainage ditch with multiple bullet holes. Not exactly a master criminal, he was arrested pretty quickly and ultimately convicted. The publicity from the California case would then lead to an anonymous tip called into authorities to ask them to search his home for Sandra Graham, who was a 21-year-old Tampa woman who went missing on April 17, 1980. But then a woman came forward to say that she believed there were 6 others that could be found on his property, which surrounded the trailer where he lived. While she didn't see him take their lives, she did have knowledge of the crime. So maybe he was a little bit better of a criminal than I gave him credit for. Not that he deserves credit for anything. While they didn't find the 6 that was claimed, they did find 4 women. The one they located first was identified as Sandra Jean Graham. This was actually the woman included in the tip that was called in. Sandra was a 21-year-old divorcee who disappeared from a bar in West Tampa, Florida. A second young woman was identified as Elaine Ziegler, who was only 15. She'd been visiting from Warren, Ohio. Poor girl suddenly disappeared from a campground she was staying at with family near Brooksfield, Florida in 1975. The third person found was our Jane Doe today, who was just identified.
Those remains were found in 1981, along with those of 4 others in the backyard of convicted serial killer Billy Mansfield Jr.'s family home. It wasn't until last year that Teresa's were identified.
But sadly, this means there is one more still unidentified Jane Doe, who we will also cover in this case. It's unclear if his crime started before 1975. They know that just after the teen disappeared from her campground, that he assaulted a babysitter in 1977. In that case, he got only 6 months of prison time and 36 months probation, and clearly having probation over his head didn't bother him. He would go on to commit an indecent assault against 2 teenagers. This did lead to his parole being revoked. But while inside the prison, his cellmate confessed to his own crime against a child, and Junior went ahead and turned his cellmate in. This got him time off for good behavior. It allowed him to get back out of jail after only a year. Rita hurt more people. The 2 brothers took to covering their faces with bags, while they both assaulted or attempted to assault women. Court documents indicate that the indecent assaults were not just on the part of Junior, but they also included Junior's brother Gary, as well as their father Billy Sr. When the family was done, raining terror on all of these women, it was Junior that would take their lives. Gary was eventually charged along with Junior for being an accessory and for helping Junior flee. However, Gary got off without a charge in the end, because he then turned on his brother. Junior would also plead guilty to an attempted attack on a 5th victim. He received 4 life sentences and is still in prison today. The years wound on, and the 2 women still went unidentified. It would take genetic genealogy to finally give Teresa her name back. It eventually led to her sister, who had never stopped trying to find what happened to Teresa.
Dropped the bomb on me and said that we think we might have your sister's remains.
Teresa was only 16, and she would have been 17 in a week if she'd lived to see her birthday, that year in 1980. Teresa had left the house for a job interview, and she never returned. Her life, like the others found, was only just beginning until a chance meeting with a psychopath. Her sister would say in an interview, "It just kind of came out of the blue. To put it lightly, it floored me," describing the turn of events as pretty good closure. "I'm just a little sad that, my dad died without ever knowing what happened to her. My mother died without ever knowing what happened to her." This story has many twists and turns, and in fact, Billy Mansfield Jr.'s son believes his father is innocent, despite the overwhelming evidence to the contrary. It's not specifically stated, but I suspect from what I read that his son believes that it was perhaps his Uncle Gary or the father that did the crimes. And it's true that his Uncle Gary continued hurting others while Billy Jr. was trapped in prison. Not too long ago, the brother Gary was arrested on drug charges.
Earlier this week, his brother, Gary Mansfield, was arrested on drug charges. But detectives say they also found items unrelated to the drug arrest on an adjacent property. They wouldn't reveal what they discovered, but Billy Mansfield's son, Bill Mansfield III, believes his uncle, Gary Mansfield, directed authorities to more remains.
He hoped to get off easier by telling authorities there were more bodies buried all over the property. Billy Mansfield III commented on the news on this change
Bill
of
Mansfield
events.
III has believed his father is innocent, and he hopes this possible development may point authorities to a different suspect.
Instead of the difficult part about it, there's a positive part about it. And that's what I've been trying to think about is the fact that, well, maybe Dad could get out of prison because he didn't do the things.
In the year 2020, Gary Mansfield found himself selling meth to an undercover police officer, and it couldn't happen to a more deserving guy. He made a plea for immunity, saying he could lead the authorities to more bodies. There is a claim that they have found more bodies on the property, saying they also found other items not related to the drug charges. However, it's been nearly 2 years since this happened, so I'm not sure how credible that claim is. Billy Mansfield Jr. was eligible for parole starting in 1997, which is just horrifying. He has been denied multiple times. His next parole hearing will happen in August of 2025. The Hernando Jane Doe 1981 is the one remaining unnamed victim of Mansfield. There has been 3 different sets of recreations done in this case. The remaining woman was found wrapped in a red and green blanket, found in 1981, and had been there for 1 to 3 years. She was white, around 5'4" to 5'6", and was believed to be 20 to 30 years old. If those estimates are correct, and they aren't always, her family would be looking for someone who was born around the years of 1948 to 1960. She had an aqua blue ceramic pendant that was approximately 1 inch in diameter. Teresa Caroline Fillingham and the Hernando Jane Doe went unidentified for 40 years. In the case of the Hernando Jane Doe, it's 40 years and counting. The Pulaski County Jane Doe, identified as Christy Denise York Witcher. On July 2, 1995, the skeletal remains of a young woman were found by a pair of hunters who were camping out in Nancy, Kentucky, in a wooded area near Cumberland Parkway. This area is in the southern part of the state. They discovered her skull first, and along with some clothing, they pretty quickly discovered the rest of her remains. We know that she had a broken rib and someone had cut her throat, but all of the main questions like who and why remain unanswered for the next 24 years. She had been listed as being 24 to 45, around 5'2", and suffering from a degenerative joint disease that may have caused her pain all of the time. We now know that Christy Witcher lived in Scottsville, Kentucky. Only 9 days after her 24th birthday, she walked out of her home in a Scottsville trailer park and vanished. This was on July 30th, 1993. A 24-year-old mother who had 3 kids, a daughter and 2 sons. There's no mention of a husband, although all of the kids have the last name of Witcher. This does raise some questions, as all 3 kids have the last name, and her maiden name was York. I have no idea in this case if he's a suspect or if he was already gone by then. We know she was found almost exactly 2 years after she seemingly disappeared into thin air that was about 100 miles away from her home in Nancy. She just left one day and didn't come back. Her sister Christy would say she was going to work with the carnival that was here in Allen County, and nobody has seen her since. My sister was always a wanderer. She would never stay in one place at one time. She liked to go. She would go, and she would stay gone for a couple of weeks, but she'd always come back. But this time, she didn't come back. It does appear she was likely in a higher risk group for having something happen. There's no mention of where the kids are or were, or if they had a good life. Maybe it's just the mother and me, but it feels like an important piece of this story that's missing. It's possible what happened to her was that she encountered a serial named Larry Dwayne Hall, who kidnapped and took her life, though I'd like to know what you all think about this. Christy was found after Hall was arrested for the kidnapping and murder of a 15-year-old named Jessica Roach, for which he was convicted. He was a man with a lower IQ of around 85, who took the lives of at least 50 women between 1991 and 1994 throughout Indiana, Missouri, Illinois, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, and Wisconsin. However, it doesn't appear there's any proof he was active in 1995 in Kentucky. His name comes up a lot in a lot of these cases. He tended to seek out Civil War reenactments. He then used his time where the reenactment took place on his downtime to take the lives of victims. It seems sometimes to me anyway that they throw out serial offenders pretty easily, though I do understand why they question it, considering especially how high Hall's victim count already is. But it doesn't look like this is a viable suggestion. It does make me more curious about her husband or what else was going on at the time. She wouldn't be reported missing for a full year. Over the years, the rumor mill in Kentucky was ripe, and her sister Peggy heard a lot of rumors about what may have happened to Christy. One of those rumors was that her sister had been buried in a shallow grave. In truth, this is what happened, although knowing what happened came too late for her mother, who passed away before Christy was identified. Her father, however, is still alive. Peggy said she used to randomly search online, hoping to locate Christy. Her family considered that maybe she was living her life somewhere else, choosing to put her original life behind her. The not knowing for sure is what aided them. Peggy submitted her DNA to the authorities decades ago, in case there would be a hit through CODIS. So that's what's odd about this. In fact, it says online that Christy's DNA was already on file, and it had been listed since 2013. Usually they all end up in the same place in CODIS, and there should have been a hit. But clearly there wasn't. In fact, they had not just Peggy's DNA, but the DNA of 2 of Peggy's 3 kids. Since the advent of centralized databases, it should have led to a match. There are different types of DNA. Sometimes they are the kind that has to be compared once there's a similar match. Theoretically, that is the type that's being searched. It's a different kind that they use to search through genealogical bases, which is why you'll see where they have DNA listed as being on file, but they'll still have to exhume the person to obtain more DNA. Her sister Peggy said it's a big relief, don't got to wonder anymore. The wondering part is over. Now just concentrate on who did it, and hopefully maybe someday we'll find that out. But I mean, it's been a lot of years, so I don't have a lot of faith in that. Christy Denise York Witcher went unidentified for 24 years, the same number of years she lived on this earth. Had she been allowed to survive, she'd be 48 today. The St. Osyth John Doe, identified as Bill Long. This one bothers me a lot, as remains were found wearing cowboy boots in a scrapyard. No one should perish in a garbage dump. The scrapyard was located in St. Osyth, Essex, in England. Bill had been doing some part-time work in that scrapyard where he was found, but the yard was eventually closed and sold to be developed as a holiday village. Eventually, this led to Bill being found. They were cleaning up the area for the development, and some items of clothing were found, including a shirt and jeans that had disintegrated. We know now that it was 1996 when Bill went missing, and his remains weren't located until 2019. It's hard to know if that was even the year he passed away. If it was 23 years later that he would be found. The police were unable to determine his cause of death, but they also don't believe it was natural. Bill would have been 46 years old at the time he was last seen. When they found his remains, they estimated him to be 50 at the time, and they said he'd been there for 2 decades. The item that startles me personally the most is the distinctive cowboy boots. Those boots were still being worn by Bill's remains when he was found. If anyone is from the UK, it would be great if you could comment about the databases used in the UK to match missing people with John and Jane Does. They were able to get some DNA from him at the time, and it was in some sort of local database, but no hits were found. Bill was born in 1950, and he'd been living with his father. So when his father passed away in 1996, Bill found himself feeling emotionally lost. He took off for Australia, eventually meeting a woman and falling in love. The pair would eventually travel back to the UK, but for some reason, Bill ceased contact with the rest of his family. For whatever reason, the family didn't question it, and they believed Bill had just returned with his girlfriend to start a new life. It was for this reason that Bill wouldn't be reported missing. It's a common story, and it's sad, but his sister would say she feels extremely guilty for not checking on her brother, describing him as being vulnerable. Personally, I think it's sometimes so easy to internalize blame when it's not really so cut and dried. Perhaps the biggest gap, too, is that the girlfriend who was with him at the time didn't report him missing, though it's possible she doesn't know what happened either. The police in the UK do have the girlfriend's name, and it appears this is an ongoing case. The police do very much still need people to come forward with information about Bill's movements. His sister Patricia describes her brother as being a target for scammers and someone that was often taken advantage of. The police would eventually use unconventional methods to identify Bill. They were able to compile a list of people who had access to the abandoned scrapyard, but it took a considerable amount of time because the yard itself was no longer in use. They then accessed local driver's license data and looked for a commonality of someone within the yard who never renewed their license. They put in a lot of work and it led to Bill. They also felt that because Bill would have been around 70, he would have been applying to draw money from his retirement fund at the time. But he hadn't done so. They would locate Bill's sister, Patricia, asking that she provide her DNA. The best they could tell is that there was a 4-year gap between his last sighting and his death, meaning Bill likely died somewhere between March of 1999 and March of 2000. Bill was missing for 26 years. He went unidentified for 3. The Flowery Branch Jane Doe, identified as Sarai Llanos Gómez. She was just 19 and living in Ecuador when she made the difficult decision to come over to the U.S. in hopes of a better life, settling in Chicago, Illinois. She had the belief that she could work hard and eventually send for her children, sending her mother the message, "Mommy, America is beautiful." Before we dig in, I ask that people try to refrain from judging the legality of coming here. The story isn't about that, it's about walking in her shoes, just for a moment. One of my best friends actually came here from Guatemala, also ending up in Chicago, but she arrived at the age of 10. What I learned, though, through her experience in the 1980s, is that there was a lot of people attempting to take advantage of people here illegally. I didn't realize people leverage their situations so often for their own gain. And that is more what this story is about. In the case of my friend, her mother cleaned and her father worked as a mechanic, both working 7 days a week. But what shocked me is many of the people rarely paid them what was agreed upon, saying to them once the work was done, "What are you going to do, turn us into the police?" And it's true. I'd never thought much about the additional layer of what happens once people get here. And then, of course, there are groups set out to sell people, human traffickers that prey on the at-risk in this group. So with that said, let's jump in. The reason Sarai found herself in the U.S. appears to have originated after speaking to a friend in Ecuador. The woman's name was Shakira, although it doesn't appear that was her real name. The woman approached her about wanting to have a better life for her children. Some of the story is a bit convoluted, and the translation of much of it comes from Spanish, which I don't speak. Many of those Spanish articles conflict from article to article. So while it isn't extremely clear, I've done my best to assess what her mother has said to reporters and what was consistent. It appears this woman, going by Shakira, was recruiting beautiful women on behalf of a man who was known as the Russian. What isn't clear is how she ended up in Chicago originally. It appears she may have had an uncle living there that sold Ecuadorian food from a food cart, instead of doing whatever it was that Shakira suggested. It also appears she was still in contact with the woman going by Shakira. That woman kept pressing her to contact a Russian man who owned a business in the Atlanta area. That business was supposedly a hotel with a restaurant. It also appears they tried to sell the idea that it was part of a Marriott hotel chain, though there's no indication this ever was true. It was designed in order to make the job seem safe and a good idea, though it now appears that this woman was a scout for the Russian man she was working for. She convinced Sarai to go work as a waitress, saying the job paid well. She asked Shakira what she would need to do, and Shakira asked about having papers to work legally. Sarai responded that she did not. The Russian eventually instructed she would need to marry Shakira, though I'm not sure if Shakira was a U.S. citizen. Either way, however it was sold, it appears they did travel to Las Vegas, and that the woman was here at some point. A wedding was paid for and done, with our Jane Doe having paid for it. It convinced the young woman that her life was changing for her and her kids that she left behind. She had hoped this job in Atlanta was that opportunity that would change everything. She texted her mother many times a day, and so her mother was in the unique position of knowing what was going on at almost every moment. She told her mother that the Russian man who promised her higher wages if she would travel to work in his restaurant. She was suspicious, however, and concerned that it was some sort of a trick and wasn't true. It may have had to do with the way she was enticed to come to the U.S. in the first place. She eventually told her mother that the man she was dealing with answered all her questions in a way that seemed honest. She now believed his claim that he was just looking for honest people willing to work hard at his business. With this, she felt her key to the American dream was in place. She was a hard worker, and this was that opportunity that she'd been looking for. Then, on the afternoon of June 14th, 2022, the dream exploded. It was all a lie. She arrived in Atlanta, and she was ordered to entertain a specific group of men that the Russian had gathered. This was to be done in exchange for money. She said she was told there was no other options. She would be doing this. She was both angry and terrified. She stood her ground, however, and was absolutely adamant that she would not be complying. She eventually believed that she had the upper hand. She texted her mother to tell her that she told the men that she would tell the police what was going on if they didn't agree to set her free and allow her to decline to participate. In fact, she appeared not to be terrified after she threatened the Russian man and the group he wanted entertained. She was able to text her mother saying she'd refuse, and she believed she would be promptly returned to Chicago the following day. She was also pretty furious with the man she kept referring to as the Russian. It's not clear what happened after this point, as her texts abruptly stopped. The following morning, June 15th, 2022, her mother, Gardenia, wrote her daughter what was her normal good morning message. This was at 7 a.m. Sarai's time. This time, though, unlike any other morning, no reply was returned. Gardenia was terrified something bad had happened to her daughter, and she immediately called the hotel. Luckily, she knew the name of where her daughter was at. Whoever she spoke to said that Sarai wasn't registered at the hotel, and they would not be checking on her. She did learn that the hotel rooms were under the Russian's name. That implies they do have that name, but it's not been released. They then told her because Gardenia wasn't his family, there was nothing they could do. According to an interview her mother gave to Univision, she kept calling the hotel and wouldn't give up. It took days, but on her last call, a Mexican immigrant answered, and that woman was extremely sympathetic to the situation. It was that woman who agreed to not just look for Sarai, but to ask around, find out what happened, and call her mother back. And she did. She learned that Sarai was caught on hotel surveillance that night at 12:30 a.m., and she was seen getting into a car. However, it appeared that Sarai went willingly. Her mother tried hard to hold on to hope that her daughter was okay, since it didn't look like she was in distress. We know now it's possible she was told she was being given a ride home. Her mother would eventually suggest that the Russian either forced her to be tricked out to whomever picked her up, or that her daughter was fooled into believing it was her ride home. Gardenia Gómez even called the Russian man, pretending to be Shakira, and she got through. He would tell Gardenia that her daughter must have met someone, and that Gardenia is absolutely not to file a complaint with the police, saying that her daughter would be back when whomever picked her up tired of her, probably a day or two. This actually convinced Gardenia that she needed to immediately file a report. It took Gardenia 9 days to reach the Department of Foreign Ministry in Ecuador, after being told this was where she needed to call to report her daughter missing. They then coordinated with the United States, or, more specifically, the state of Georgia. It was June 30th when the Atlanta police were finally alerted to the missing woman's existence. By then, Sarai was far beyond anyone's help. Her body had already been in the morgue in Atlanta for 10 days, listed as a Jane Doe. Turns out that a worker was cleaning up an Atlanta park when they discovered a woman who'd been the victim of a stabbing, prompting the Hall County Sheriff to release a portrait in hopes of identifying the young woman. This did help identify her, and once she was identified, they knew about the video of her getting in a vehicle. Because of her mother's quick response, a recreation was able to be made, and that drawing was released of that man. On July 25th, Gardenia received a devastating call that her daughter had been identified by fingerprints. She believes her grandson somehow knows, saying the 1.5-year-old boy was inconsolable and could no longer sleep. He cries constantly. He used to hear his mother's voice on the phone every day, but that is no more. So while this kind of thing probably happens to a lot of young women, Gardenia Gómez's activity made a huge difference in identifying the person who took her daughter's life. It took very little time for a 49-year-old man identified as Timothy Kruger from Duluth, Georgia, to be identified. He was taken to the Gwinnett County Police Headquarters on August 4th, eventually confessing. It's known that Kruger took her life in his home in Duluth, Georgia, but it's unclear why, if it was at the behest of the Russian, or if it was related to that man at all. If they know, they haven't released it. And if anyone out there knows anything about this case, please call the number given. I've included Crime Stoppers, where you can give an anonymous tip. It's hard not to think that there is more to the story. She threatened a human trafficker, and somebody took her out right after. Homeland Security has stated they are investigating part of her case to see if there's more to it. Sergeant Jennifer Richter of the Gwinnett County Police Department made what I find to be a really insulting and misleading statement, especially given what we know and what they had to have known at the time. She said that Sarai was involved in sex work and had come into contact with Mr. Kruger through her occupation, and simply stated that there's a danger in working in that occupation, which is a huge glossing over of facts. As I've mentioned many times, the motto of this channel is that everyone matters, and blaming her for her own death does no one any good, and it certainly seems to get the human traffickers off the hook, and I don't think that's fair. Gardenia Gómez is saving money to come to the U.S. to claim her daughter's remains. I'd hope to be able to post a fundraiser here for her, but if it's available, I wasn't able to find one, and I did comb through a lot of Spanish language articles. Sarai's children will permanently live with their grandmother. Sarai Gómez went unidentified for 1 month. Thank you everybody for watching and listening. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't yet. Take care of yourselves and each other.